You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm hosting a discussion about sex education. It's been shown that many teenagers are regularly exposed to pornography through the internet. The images they see there are often extreme and have been blamed for giving young people a distorted view on sex and relationships. In 2011, an EU-wide survey found that a quarter of 9 to 16-year-olds had seen sexual images. And in October, a sex education website called Respect Yourself, created by a team from Warwickshire County Council working with the NHS, went online. The site uses explicit pictures of a naked couple, a sectionary with slang terms for sexual organs, and a Q&A for all kinds of sexual acts. It provoked widespread criticism from various family charities and pressure groups. But the people behind the website say it's just presenting an honest view to teenagers of what sex is like. Britain already has the highest rate of teenage pregnancies and abortions in Western Europe, and prompts the question, are we getting sex education right in the UK? Joining me in the studio to discuss this is Dr Hannah Maslen, a post-doctoral research fellow at the Oxford Centre for Neuroethics, and Andrew Marsh, Deputy Director of Christian Concern, and on the phone, Amy Danahay, Campaign Manager for the Respect Yourself website, and Professor David Paton, Chair of Industrial Economics at Nottingham University Business School. Thank you all for coming. I'd first like to ask you all very briefly, are we getting sex education right in this country? Hannah.
It seems to me that it's in a period of transition at the moment, and having looked at Brook Charity research last year that showed that there was a demand from young people that sex education would be updated, it seems like that's what's going on at the moment, and it's sort of finding its current level.
Okay, Andrew?
I don't think we are. I think we still have a very high teenage pregnancy rate. We still have high incidence of sexually transmitted diseases amongst young people. But more than that, I don't think that we're really equipping either parents or children very effectively to deal with sex, but not just sex in isolation, sex in the broader context of relationships, and giving them the emotional, ethical, moral, spiritual, psychological, as well as physical framework in which to place that.
Amy Danahay.
I think it's very hard to generalise. I think there are some schools and some teachers across the country that are getting it right, but I think for far too long we've been hearing from young people that it's too little, it's too late, it's too mechanical and too biological. And we keep hearing that, and yet we don't seem to be able to change that perception amongst young people. They're still having to learn about relationships and sex from other places, other people, their peers. And so I think to generalise is a difficult one, but I don't think we are taking our responsibilities seriously enough.
And David?
Well, as Amy says, there's good and bad practice going on around the country. I think perhaps where some people get it wrong is in thinking that the solution is to try and impose on schools a single model of sex education at a particular age. I think children vary enormously in their maturity, in their ability to cope with and their needs for different information, and we should recognise that as we currently do in the sort of legal situation for sex education. But more importantly, we need to remember that most of the evidence says sex education has very little impact on things like teenage pregnancy and so on, so we shouldn't overstate its importance.
Amy Danahay, you're campaign manager for Respect Yourself, this new website that's come up. First of all, what does your website seek to achieve?
No, the website's got two very clear aims. One is about informing young people around relationships, sexual health, all the social and physical aspects of growing up, really. So because they've been saying for a long time that they don't have one place where they can access that information to make informed choices. But the other aspect of it was to develop an app that would look at some of the barriers to accessing services, because we know that young people aren't accessing services the way that they should at the moment. And so we wanted to look at what the barriers were to accessing those services and then create some sort of behaviour intervention tool that would help young people to access them. So the techniques, the research that we looked at translated into a number of features that help to develop positive attitudes and confidence amongst young people.
This is widely available to children, correct me if I'm wrong, as young as 13?
It is aimed at 13 to 19-year-olds, yes.
Do you feel that's an appropriate age?
I think it is an appropriate age. As somebody commented earlier, young people are maturing at very different ages. We do know that young girls, for example, are hitting puberty as young as 9, and some boys are. So as much as we're saying it's 13 and upwards, we recognise also that some of the information may be fairly useful for young people experiencing puberty.
Are you concerned that this sort of information, it may encourage teenagers to experiment sexually at such a young age?
No, not at all. And a lot of research does show that actually just because we talk to young people about relationships and sex education, it doesn't mean that young people are more likely to go out and have sex. What we've tried to do is address the fact that young people are becoming more sexualised through their exposure to an enormous amount of explicit content through technology these days. And, one study showed that an average young person will have their first exposure to pornography by the age of 10, and that teens, about 58% of them, are watching porn regularly. So what we've tried to do is make sure that we're giving young people a website that they can access the information that they want. It's not necessarily changing their behaviour. The only behaviour we're trying to change, if you like, is through this app and make sure that more young people are encouraged to access services when they need it. But what we're trying to do is equip young people with the tools that they need to make informed choice.
Hannah?
I'd just like to come in on that. I think Amy makes a really good point, and I read objections, particularly to the sex dictionary on the website, saying that it could encourage an unhealthy obsession with physical acts, as if teenagers would start reading about all the things they could do and then decide they needed to go and try it. And I think there's an interesting comparison to be drawn with websites such as Talk to Frank, which address drug use and provide information on drugs. And the lists talk about all the sort of enjoyment people get from them, the positive experiences as well as how to stay safe and things like that. And I just think there's an interesting comparison to be drawn there when we're looking at the argument that providing information will encourage particular behaviours.
Andrew?
Well, I just think, Hannah's mentioned the sex dictionary, the sectionary on the site, and it's just worth underlining that some of those terms on there are pretty non-mainstream. Now, I think that there may be some good intentions behind a site like this, but one of its great pitfalls is the fact that it's on open access. And I think, as nearly everyone has acknowledged already, children mature at very different ages. And a open website like this that is openly available doesn't really address that issue. And I think behind that is my bigger concern even than that it tends to actually bypass parents. Parents, in the main, are the best placed people to help their children. It's not an easy thing to do sometimes, but it is an important thing to do. And rather than, even if there's good intentions behind an offering like this, what it can inadvertently do, the law of unintended consequences, I think, is encourage children to bypass their parents and find access to information that some may be familiar with, but many more won't be familiar with terms like that, particularly at the age of 13. Bypass parents rather than engage with them. What we really need to be doing, as well as other things, is equipping parents, helping parents to see that they have primary responsibility and equipping them to be able to talk to their children honestly and openly about that.
David, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would. I think one of the important things is to think about the type of information that's provided and the impact that might have. And we would all agree that young people at the right age need information about sex and contraception and so on. But I think there's a difference between providing information like that and providing information that facilitates underage sexual activity. And Amy was talking about access to services, and the site clearly sort of provides pathways to access to emergency contraception and so on. And there is actually some quite good evidence that improving access to contraception and particularly the morning after pill for minors, for under 16s, does lead to greater risky sexual activity. And contrary to what many people might think and the intention of these services, it doesn't seem to lead to lower pregnancy rates. The reason being that young people do end up having more risky sexual activity, and there was a study I did with a colleague which came out last year finding that areas which were promoting the morning after pill more than others were seeing bigger increases in sexually transmitted infections, but no decrease in teenage pregnancy rates. So exactly this law of sort of unintended consequences.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. Amy, you can come in on this. You've based this website on a Dutch model.
We have, yes. We've spent a lot of time with partners in the Netherlands looking at how they approach relationships and sex education. And we went out, spent a lot of time, but there's also a huge amount of research out there. And they use technology. Their rates are 5 times lower than that of ours over here. And whilst accepting the fact that, our cultures are slightly different, etc., there's some really good practice and evidence-based practice out there that we wanted to learn from. If I could just sort of go back to the parents' side, a point raised very well earlier by Andrew, I think if we go back to young people, absolutely, young people do want to get their information from parents, and we mustn't overlook that, and that is why we have a parents tab built in right throughout this website. And young people were very specific about the fact that they do want to be able to get their information from parents. And also, we hope that parents will also find this website very useful. We had a comment come through, parents, get this website up for your children and offer to answer any questions arising honestly and without judgment. It will lead to a happier adolescence and more informed and confident young adult. And that's very much how the Netherlands approach it. Parents are absolutely key in this whole agenda.
I'd just like to raise the issue that Andrew brought up earlier about some of the language that's used. Looking at some of the FAQ section, some of the questions: can you have sex in the ear? Do Welsh people have to shag sheep? Does anyone else's penis let out tomato sauce during sex? Is that appropriate?
I think we have to recognise that young people talk a lot about sex with their peers, and these are some of them I'm sure were posted to us in a very jokey nature, some of them with a very serious background to them. And what we've tried to do is show young people that this is a website where they can ask questions. That we always say in sexual health, no question is a silly question. And that's what we're trying to get across to young people. Feel free to answer the questions. We'll answer them honestly, but it gives us a platform to be able to answer with some very clear public health messages behind them.
Let's move on to parents. What about involving parents more in teaching sexual education? Andrew?
Well, I would certainly like to see us as a society do more of that, and for that to be central to the philosophy, which I don't think it has been in the main. Of course, there will be good exceptions to this, as David made the point and others earlier, that there is variation in provision of services, but I don't think I think there has been a tendency that somehow professionals know better. I think a much better philosophy would be to make this kind of important education aspect of growing up family-centric. So, as I say, to be equipping parents and to invest much more resources, practical resources, in doing that. Because I think what's important in this area is not just information. Children need information, and they need accurate information, and that is delivered through science programs in science teaching in school, as well as other areas. Information, but they also need direction, they need affirmation, it needs to be relational, and the danger, particularly of a website, is that it lacks that relational element. So I would like much more creative thinking. I think there are some good examples. I think churches and other charities are doing work to try and promote parenting classes and help parents navigate, because the parents are genuinely concerned for their children, concerned about these things.
I guess it's a lot of people would say it's quite an awkward situation, though. You obviously see in these Hollywood films where the father goes up and he has that conversation with his son. Maybe some parents would just find it too much of a taboo, perhaps.
Well, I think, yes, I think that there is some awkwardness about it. That's why, if we think it's important, we've actually got to invest in it, come up with creative solutions, put on courses and make it easy for people, I think. Easier.
Hannah?
Yeah, aside from the sort of awkwardness issue, what would you say about a situation where parents had very, very strict, unusually strict views about sex and the role it should play in relationships and marriage, etc., and where a child would, under your sort of family-centric model, receive only quite a particularly strict view on sex that might not equip them for more wider society?
Well, I think in one sense this website and other material is based on the premise that actually children have access to a lot of different sources already. So every child is going to have access to talking to peers and access to accurate information about the nature of sex through the education programs at school and through the internet. So I don't think it's that anyone is going to be completely set off. But I think that back to the issue of we've got to treat people as individuals, not just impose a blanket program at a kind of national level downwards. I think a child in that situation actually needs to engage with that, because they will be massively shaped by their parents, as we all are, and by the values of that family. And much better to engage with those and talk them through and understand what parents are teaching, why they and their views and why they've come to those views. That's actually respecting the child as well as the family and the parents. I think we don't want to suggest that de facto those different viewpoints that may differ from ours are wrong. We need to examine them on a case-by-case basis.
David, you mentioned there shouldn't be this single model of sex education. What are your views on parents' involvement in this?
There's a number of interesting things here. Just I'm also a parent and also a governor at a school and involved in the sex education program there. Clearly, parents sometimes get things wrong and make mistakes, but I think we need to remember also that sex education organisations also may make mistakes with some children, and schools may do too. And probably on balance, I would rather sort of trust to parents who know their children the best. But in terms of there's some nice research looking at the impact of including parents in these decisions. So there's some research looking at what at the moment in England, young people 13, sometimes younger, can be put on a pill or given a contraceptive implant or taken for an abortion, and their parents don't have to know. And there's some nice research looking at what happens when you change that, so parents have to be involved in these decisions. And in fact, what seems to happen is that when parental involvement is mandatory, young people actually change their decision-making, and fewer young people start to have sex at an early age in the first place. Fewer of them get pregnant, and you end up with fewer abortions and fewer teenage pregnancies. It's sort of a win-win situation, as well as getting fewer STIs. And I think that's quite an interesting route the government might want to look at to try and sort of bring back parents into the mix. Can I just come back to one of the other issues you were talking about, which is Holland? Because the situation in Holland is much more complex than people sometimes think, and there's some great research by Professor Van Loon who shows quite conclusively that sex education in the Netherlands isn't particularly liberal compared to the UK. In fact, there's a vast variety of practice. Some of the sex education there is very, very conservative. Some of it is quite explicit and liberal. But overall, there's not much difference to the UK. It starts in schools probably a little bit later than the UK. And parents have quite a say over what happens in sex education through their roles in schools. So it's clearly not sex education that is driving the difference in teenage pregnancy rates between the Netherlands and the UK and England. And indeed, you only have to look at the other countries with very low rates of under 16 pregnancies. And these are countries like Northern Ireland, Ireland, Poland, where sex education is, probably more on the traditional model. It's clear that sex education isn't the driving force for different teenage pregnancy rates.
Just to quote some figures, the teen birth rate in 2011 in UK, 24 girls per 1,000. In the Netherlands, it's 4 girls per 1,000. If it's not sex education, what do you feel it is?
The differences are the underlying social things. For example, levels of poverty, family breakdown, which tend to be much lower in the Netherlands, the impact of religion. So Professor Van Loon shows that in many ways the Netherlands is quite a sort of traditional society with quite liberal laws, and it's sort of a misperception that people have in England. This is, it's a very liberal attitude. Now, clearly there is a difference in the Netherlands which arises from the sort of strong family culture, that there is better communication between parents and young people. So a parent will know, generalising, but a parent will know where their 15-year-old is at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, where perhaps that isn't such the norm in some parts of England. So they're the really important things. It's not the access to contraception or sex education or so on that are driving pregnancy rates. And there's all sorts of research to show that.
Hannah, would you agree with that? Is it possibly more of a societal thing rather than simply, sex education?
Yeah, I've read the research. I don't know if it's the same research that you were referring to from the Family Education Trust, and they cite many different social factors, including things like stigma. There's much greater stigma in the Netherlands attached to becoming a teenage mother. The welfare benefits operate very differently. So in the Netherlands, it's not usual a teenage mother would receive the same sorts of welfare welfare benefits. And they also cite the fewer mothers working. So the idea is that teenagers, young people, spend more time with their mothers because they're not often providing half of the family income. So there's all sorts of social factors, which, I don't know, looking at things like stigma, it's questionable whether that's necessarily entirely a good thing, but it's only one of many social factors.
Just a final point, David mentioned very briefly the impact of religion. There's less of an impact of religion in Holland compared to in the UK. Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on religion playing a part in sexual education?
Well, I think that the Christian faith and the church that teaches clearly the Bible and what Jesus Christ himself stands for has a key part to play in this, as in every area of life. I think the truth that the Bible teaches us, that all of us are created in God's image, that we are loved by him and special to him, actually is key fundamentally to understanding who we are, and equips young people actually to have a basis for good relationships, for self-esteem and self-respect. It introduces another dimension and actually equips people for healthy sexual relationships in marriage, a healthy family. One of the things we talked about has been mentioned in terms of the Netherlands is that strong family culture, and certainly the Christian faith has driven that and supported that in terms of its emphasis on family. And I do think that one of the things that we're in danger of missing in general in this discussion is that, as into the wider discussion, not so much today's discussion, that the measures of success of sex education policy can be defined too narrowly, as though the only measures are the rate of unintended pregnancies and the rate of sexually transmitted disease among young people. And that really fails to recognise the much bigger issues that are at stake, alongside those of the emotional trauma that can be caused by relationships, confusion, breakdown of relationships, breakdown of family, that early sexual experimentation can have a big part in playing.
Amy, very quickly, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that teenage pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, I think the whole agenda is incredibly complex. And, I do think that there's not just one key element that is going to make the difference. I think what we have to recognise is that there's many, many contributing factors. There was some research back in 2005 conducted by the Teenage Pregnancy Unit in the DFE, looking at, access to services, sex and relationships education, and many other different aspects. So there are so many complex factors going on in this. But the one thing that I would like to say is that we talk very much about parents, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that not all young people are lucky enough to have parents to be able to lean on. But I know that many areas across the country see parents as an absolute key to being able to sort of overcome some of these high rates that we're seeing, but most importantly, to support young people. The website that we're obviously discussing at the beginning is just one small approach that we're taking. And I know that many other areas see parents and supporting families as absolutely key.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm hosting a discussion about sex education. Are we getting sex education right in the UK? Joining me in the studio to discuss this is Dr Hannah Maslen, a post-doctoral research fellow at the Oxford Centre for Neuroethics, and Andrew Marsh, Deputy Director of Christian Concern, and on the phone by Amy Danahay, Campaign Manager for the Respect Yourself website, and Professor David Paton, Chair of Industrial Economics at Nottingham University Business School. We're slightly running out of time. Let's just move on briefly. I want to talk about the impact of pornography on children's lives. It seems that culture is becoming more and more overly sexualised. The National Association of Head Teachers has been calling for children to be taught in an age-appropriate way about the impact of pornography. David, does that need to happen?
Well, clearly, it's a very big issue amongst young people, as any parent will be aware. I saw the report by the Association of Head Teachers. I think one of the concerning things was that they seem to be using that as a mechanism for trying to have statutory or sort of compulsory type of sex education in schools, and that sort of goes back to what I was saying before, that's probably the wrong model. It's not that we shouldn't be looking to have a one-size-fits-all curriculum which applies to all schools children vary in terms of their needs at different ages and what's appropriate in different cultures, different types of schools. So I just sort of caution against going down that line of moving away from where we are at the moment, which is that schools and their governors, under the influence of parents, decide what type of sex education they will have in secondary schools and indeed in primary schools, whether or not they will have sex education. That's probably one of the good things we have in sex education policy in this country at the moment.
Amy, what are your thoughts on the impact of pornography on young people's lives?
I do think that young people need to be able to be equipped. Like I said at the beginning, at the moment it's too little, it's too late. And I think, yes, pornography is one of those things that should be built in an age-appropriate way, right from primary school. But it's more about empowering young people to have the confidence to say no, to know themselves, to be able to respect themselves and to be able to respect others. And I completely agree that, a one-size curriculum won't fit all. It has to be this whole school approach. It has to be the school working with the young people, with the teachers, with management, with parents, to be able to look at what are the particular needs of those young people, what's going on in the world, and to be able to make those informed choices as to the best approach to the education within that school. I think more importantly, the fact that young people need information to be able to make informed choices needs to be seen as more of a priority by schools. So it's about a wider agenda. It's about alcohol use, substance misuse, pornography. All of those aspects need to be joined up, and it needs to be seen more as a priority of schools in amongst maths, English, science, and all of those elements.
Andrew?
I think we are in danger as a culture, sending very mixed messages on these kind of issues. I mean, on the one hand, we talk about the over-sexualisation of our culture, and particularly to do with the impact on young people. And yet, on the other, there is a dominant messaging, I think, in much material, in much of our kind of social fabric that says, if it feels good, do it. And I think those two things, we can't hold them together. I think what it stems from is an increasing anxiety in our society as to what does give individuals meaning, what does give us a basis for self-respect and for respecting others. And I think we've got big questions to ask as a society as to what gives us that foundation. Obviously, I think that the Bible in what it teaches us about God gives us a basis for respecting ourselves and respecting others and serving others. And the point that I'd make on the very concerning trends with regard to pornography is the impact of this influence that suggests to us that sex is to be viewed in terms of contract or in terms of other people as objects, the objectification in terms of sex. And that, I think, is very destructive, both for those who view pornography and those who are involved in the pornography industry. And we need to expose that and teach again that sex is part of committed relationship. I think that as a society, people are finding it increasingly easy to find sex, increasingly hard to find love.
Well, we'll have to stop there. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia from London with me, Tim Walklate. Today I've been hosting a discussion about sex education. Are we getting sex education right in the UK? Joining me today in the studio to discuss this was Dr Hannah Maslen, a post-doctoral research fellow at the Oxford Centre for Neuroethics.